Hi, and welcome to the U.S. Global Change Research Program's webinar series on climate, food, and culture, hosted by the Social Science Coordinating Committee. My name is Ariella Zeikerman, and I'm a program manager and social scientist in the Climate Program Office at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm also co-chair of the USGCRP's Social Science Coordinating Committee. Next slide. The U.S. Global Change Research Program began as a presidential initiative in 1989. It was mandated by Congress in the U.S. Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. It's overseen by the Subcommittee on Global Change Research, composed of representatives from each of USGCRP's 13 federal member agencies. Next slide. The USGCRP's Social Science Coordinating Committee is one of a few interagency working groups that supports the USGCRP. The mission of the Social Science Coordinating Committee is to foster integration of the methods, findings, and disciplinary perspectives of the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches that include those sciences into USGCRP activities. The committee serves as a social science resource to other USGCRP interagency working groups, the Subcommittee on Global Change Research, and other USGCRP activities like the National Climate Assessment. Next slide, please. The Food, Culture, and Climate webinar series is one effort by the committee to highlight the ways in which a wide variety of social science research considers climate change in a socio-cultural context. It's also to draw attention to the humanistic frameworks that shape how we understand the complex and diverse ways individuals, households, and communities experience climate change. We chose food as a focal topic because of its universality. Food is something that everyone needs to survive. It's a human right, but its availability, its producibility, and its consumability can be used as an indicator for human well-being, change, vulnerability, and inequality. The impacts of climate on food, specifically agriculture, are well documented in the natural and physical sciences. But food is not just a biological outcome. From production to consumption, food is embedded in socio-cultural systems. It's representative of so much more. This series builds on past efforts by the USGCRP to understand how people are at the center of interactions between climate change and food. For example, the report Climate Change, Global Food Security, and the U.S. Food System unpacks how climate change is and will impact the availability and the accessibility of food in a multitude of ways. But in this series, we dig deeper into the meaning of food by using a socio-cultural lens and research methods that highlight the experiences of communities, their values, their norms, their attitudes, and their beliefs, and the systems that shape them and are shaped by them in order to understand what can be lost to climate change and why. But also how to turn those same socio-cultural frameworks and understand them in order to see how communities can adapt to climate change. While on the one hand, the focus of food in this webinar series will offer real, tangible understandings of food systems and their relationships to climate through specific social scientific examples, food in some ways is also a proxy. It's a cultural example for asking much larger questions about the human experiences of climate change. Next slide. So to this end, the series has two much broader guiding questions that center humans at the core of climate science. The first question is, what are examples of socio-cultural practices and systems, and how are they impacted by climate change? And the second is, how can socio-cultural knowledge be applied to effectively build resilience to and adaptive management for climate change? Next slide. You're currently sitting in the first of 3 seminars, and today's seminar, Socio-Cultural Approaches to Climate, Food, and Agricultural Systems, focuses on land-based food systems and the ways what we eat, how we eat it, what we produce, and how we produce it are related to socio and cultural practices and systems. The second seminar builds on these same themes, sustainable and just fisheries, but focuses instead on fishing communities. And the third seminar, Putting Culture into Practice, builds on the first 2 seminars, to ask the questions of how practitioners apply social science research and sociocultural frameworks to their own work. All 3 webinars feature corresponding themes that are woven through the events, so we hope you'll consider joining us for all 3. Next slide. So without further ado, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome our panel of experts, Dr. Laurel Velante from the University of Arizona, Dr. Marie Schaefer from Michigan State University, Dr. Amy Trubeck from the University of Vermont, and Dr. Gail Myers from Farms to Grow. In today's seminar, we'll have a moderated panel discussion, followed by a short audience Q&A, and then we'll wrap up with closing remarks from Amber Campbell from the Department of Agriculture. You can put your questions in the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. But to begin, we've asked all our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their work, and then to answer the following questions from their perspectives. The first question is, what are the intersections between climate, food, and culture? And the second question is, how do understandings of food and food systems within larger sociocultural contexts give us a way to better understand the social dynamics of climate change? So I'm going to turn it to Dr. Velante to introduce herself.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Laurel Velante. I am a human environment geographer and critical food studies professor at the University of Arizona in Tucson, about an hour north of the US-Mexico border. I am a social scientist concerned with both social justice and environmental sustainability in food systems. So I use qualitative research methods to critique food systems, reveal injustices, and explore strategies for creating more just and sustainable food systems. I work from a food justice and a food sovereignty orientation, which means I critique food systems as uneven and racial projects with inequitable impacts across different regions, classes, and communities. And I think about questions of power and resource control, especially from the farmer perspective, and about how these power dynamics impact livelihoods and the possibilities for adaptation. I have 2 ongoing research projects. One is based here in Arizona with my UA Food Systems Research Lab. This project is focused on building equity and resilience in the regional food system in Southern Arizona. We first started with a lot of research focused on understanding the impacts of and lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic in our regional food system. And the next steps of this research is a collaborative process with practitioners throughout the food system to explore what we can do to further strengthen local food systems and also identify how we can leverage university and other local resources to contribute to societal change. My other ongoing project is located in Mexico, and it's focused on understanding the impacts of global environmental change and neoliberal agricultural policy on small-scale farmers in southern Mexico. In this project, I researched the ways that current vulnerabilities to climate change intersect with historical, political, economic, and cultural processes. I document not only how farmers are impacted by multiple challenges, environmental and economic stressors, but also how they are responded to these challenges, including through the formation of new farmer-to-farmer movements oriented around agroecological approaches to farming. So in answer to those first couple questions, I think it's helpful when thinking about the relationship between climate, food, and culture to remember that both the words culture and agriculture share the Latin root cultura, which means to care for or to cultivate. So throughout human history, our relationship to food and agriculture has been integral to our cultural identities, and vice versa. Our cultural identities have informed how we approach our relationship to food and agriculture. And of course, until relatively recently, foodways, or how we produce, acquire, and consume foods, have developed in close connection to the land and ecological context of particular regions. So climate, food, and culture have always been intimately interrelated. And while they continue to be interrelated today, our globalized industrial food system has also hidden and devalued these relationships and distanced many of us, particularly those of us living in urban environments, from those interconnections. I should also mention that the history of food and agriculture also linked to some of the darkest sides of culture, including cultures that have justified the widespread enslavement and exploitation of people and land for the benefit of certain populations. I think a food systems approach allows us to understand in a holistic manner how all food systems and food issues are interrelated. In other words, a change in one area often impacts all other parts of the system. So an example from my work in Mexico is how the loss of agricultural biodiversity in what is farmed simultaneously leads to a loss of cultural practices related to those foods and diminishes health outcomes for people as they consume a less diverse diet. And of course, these impacts then come around full circle. Now with the onset of human-caused climate change, we are understanding in new ways how the loss of agricultural biodiversity also threatens our ability to adapt agricultural systems to a changing climate. I want to emphasize that we are all cultural beings. There is no outside of culture. We are always ascribing to some cultural practice or another. And our culture is constantly evolving and changing, learning and innovating. So something I want to draw attention to today is the ways in which policy influences culture and how policies that shift how food is produced, processed, and consumed are always accompanied by cultural changes and ecological impacts. And I'm happy to share more about this with examples from Mexico later in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Velante. Next, we have Marie Schaefer from Michigan State.
Bonjour, Marie Schaefer des Nakas. So hi, I'm Marie. I'm Anishinaabe, Adawa specifically, and settler background. And I'm a postdoc currently at Michigan State University. I'm really honored to be on this panel. It looks like it's going to be a great conversation. So a lot of what I do is braiding knowledge systems. So trying to braid Indigenous knowledge and Western science knowledge to work on wicked problems like climate change so that we can all have, ideally, sustainable futures, we hope. So some of the ways that I go about doing that work is using Indigenous methods for research, community-based methods, so building those relationships up, really listening to community. And then my toolbox of methods, theories, and everything is pretty transdisciplinary because, frankly, humans are complicated and we need all the tools that we can get to work on these issues. So I think I have my mom's voice in my head right now to just tell the stories. So I think I'll share as part of the intro and to answer those questions 2 stories. So I'd ask you, try and find Indigenous foods at your grocery store or if you're able to harvest them. And if you're from the Great Lakes, if you're from Michigan, in particular where I'm based and where I grew up, try and find manoomin, try and find wild rice out in a river or a lake or at the grocery store. And if you do find it, let me know. So you'll probably find it in a river or lake, maybe. You won't be able to get a great harvest in Michigan. You can if you're in Wisconsin or Minnesota, but you just won't get the same harvest as you got before, frankly, settlers showed up on the landscape and the impacts of settler colonialism happened. So that's one of the most kind of heartbreaking, but we'll discuss how we navigate this too, ways to kind of understand how settler colonialism has impacted our food systems is to go looking for that Indigenous foods on the landscape. And so in Michigan, we don't have manoomin at the grocery store that is grown from a river or lake. It's grown in California on a farm. Whole long story about why that is and how it got commodified and ended up in California. No, that's another interesting intersection about kind of agriculture that we were just talking about, and then kind of wild foods or the foods grown on rivers and lakes, and how the tensions that can happen there as well. So I would challenge you to, if you're interested in food systems, if you're interested in climate change, if you're interested in these topics, go looking for the Indigenous foods on the landscape and learn about the history of why they aren't there and why they might be displaced. And so for some that are still learning about settler colonialism, there's 2 major ways that settler colonialism works. It's through disappearances and dilemmas. So disappearances, as the name kind of sounds like, it's really taking away not only the people on the landscape, so removing indigenous folks to reservations or through disease and everything else, killing us, but also our history and our food. So it's that just wiping it off, wiping people out. But then also more insidiously, like the dilemmas is really the between a rock and a hard place. So, for example, if you're a federally recognized tribe, you might have an opportunity to restore the habitat of an indigenous food such as manoomin or wild rice, but you don't have enough resources such as staff or money to do that restoration work and maybe do other priorities that are crisis priorities such as youth or healthcare or something like that. So that's that between a rock and a hard place type of situation that you're faced. And that is on purpose. That's a system that is set up, that settler colonial system. So that's, again, those two different ways that settler colonialism works, especially with food systems as well as that disappearances and then the dilemmas. And so that's why you can't see as many foods as were here before. And then a lot of my work is on braiding knowledges. So I get a lot of wonderful, smart knowledge holders and work with climate scientists, every IST, every hydrologist, anthropologist, all the ISTs. Get them in the room working on a problem like a climate adaptation plan for a tribe. I was honored to do that work with the Menominee Nation Sustainable Development Institute, working with a number of tribes in the Northeast. So if you'll indulge me, wherever you are, so this picture is of manoomin or wild rice on the shores of Lake Michigan, and I'm going to do a Michigan thing. So this is the mitten, this is the Lower Peninsula, and so it's found right here. So it's about a half an hour, not even a half an hour. So if you needed to learn how to harvest manoomin to feed your family, so imagine that you're standing on the shores of Tawas Lake, and there's this huge wild rice bed, but you've never harvested manoomin a day in your life. So you do remember that you met some cool climate scientists from the Northeast Climate Science Center, that you did another, like you sat in on a workshop with them, and they tell you kind of like what is going to happen with the climate with manoomin in the future, but you still don't know how to actually get food to your family. But they also worked with some Nokomises, some grandmas who are harvesting manoomin, and so they introduced you to them, and they actually took you out and harvest and learned and help you restore that relationship with that plant relative. So that's kind of some of that braiding knowledge that I do really quick because I'm getting the cue that I need to wrap up. But I'm excited to have my cat join us and to talk about these things, continue to talk about these things in this panel. Miigwech, thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schaefer. Let's move on and invite Amy Trubeck to introduce herself. Dr. Amy Trubeck.
Hi, yes, I'm Amy Trubeck, and I work at the University of Vermont. I've lived and worked in Vermont in different settings for 25 years. I'm trained as both a cultural anthropologist and a chef, and in many ways over the course of my career, I've done a lot of work in what you might call culinary history, but over the last 15 years, I've been very focused on helping to build the emerging field of food systems as a form of undergraduate and graduate education, for which I've done a lot of work here at UVM to build the master's and PhD that we now have in food systems. I also, the middle picture where there's that blue-purple sunset is an heirloom apple orchard where I live. So I am very involved in both things agricultural, culinary, and cultural here in the state of Vermont. So if anybody has any questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it. Anthropologists tend to be sort of magpies. We get interested in lots of different topics, and I'm certainly both proud and guilty of that. So in the early days, I focused a lot on the history of the culinary profession and thinking about chefs. And I'm actually working now with some very, very bright and talented PhD students who are coming in to work in our food systems program, because there's an increasing interest in how do we connect sustainable diets, both in relationship to individual, but also environmental health in relationship to what chefs and restaurants might be able to do to help move the needle on that. But I've also spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship of taste and place, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But I have done a lot of work working with artisans doing that kind of work. So on the right is Comté cheese. Nope, I'm sorry, that's Parmigiano Reggiano cheese from Italy, where I've done some field work. And then on the left, I was working recently with farmers in Madagascar, where there's a really interesting and I think quite complicated emerging idea that among conservationists and people that are concerned about issues of climate change in a place like Madagascar, that value-added food products are going to somehow help with conservation efforts, and I can also talk about that more later. And currently, just some of my major research, which I will talk a lot about, is always about the tension between global food supply chains and regional and local supply, and also the ways in which people have the capacity to actually enact both growing and transforming food from the raw to the cooked on a given day, something I spent a lot of time on. We call it food agency. And then I'm also do a lot of research on the concept of social embeddedness and how that might help us understand people's relationship to food and food practices in non-market ways. So I think that the main point I would want to make now as an introduction is that there's no question, if you are interested in food, climate, and culture, that we all must accept the paradox that of our modern times, that we live out our days in very proximate decision-making systems around food. So we make decisions based on our nearest grocery store, perhaps our backyards, our allotment gardens, what's available in an either walkable or drivable distance. But our capacity for nourishment is substantially dependent on global supply chains for which most individuals have no real understanding or connection, whether it be through identity, knowledge, or belief systems. And it's certainly the case in the majority of the United States, but increasingly in our increasingly urbanized world, that more and more individuals are dealing with their food in such a way that they are thinking about individual consumption practices on any given day, but they really know nothing about where or how or why those ingredients were sourced that they use. So I think that in my sense of that, we have to really, if we want to build a climate resilient and culturally relevant concept of food systems, we are going to have to really consider people's capacity and ability to act and choose accordingly. We can't, and I mean, this is obviously my training, but we can't just use raw data sets to tell people that they have to, for example, start using beans and legumes and stop consuming animal protein when they may not know how to source it. They may not understand anything about what it looks like. They may not know nothing about cooking in it. It may not be part of any of their customs or traditions. And so that sort of tension between what we think we need to do to change for greater climate resilience and the way people actually live, and the relationship of ingredients or foods understood as ingredients for the everyday practices of consumption, is something that I think is really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gail Myers to introduce herself.
Thank you. It's great to be here with everyone. I am a co-founder of a nonprofit called Farms to Grow. I did my PhD at The Ohio State University, and almost, I say, by accident, I started interviewing Black farmers. And so I spent 5 years researching, interviewing, and eventually writing a dissertation. And upon graduation, it just felt like I needed to do more. So I started a nonprofit with a farmer that I met while I was doing my PhD program in Ohio, as a way to be a support for Black farmers because of all of the experiences that Black farmers had, and I learned about them while I was doing my PhD. So I ended up being more of an activist, if you will, and someone that is preserving the stories and narratives of Black farmers as they disappear. In 1910, about 50 years after the Civil War and the end of the enslavement period, Black folks had accumulated about 16 million acres. 12 million of those were actually part owners and full owners. In less than 100 years, it's less than 4 million acres. And a lot of that land was dispossessed through unfair treatment, through discrimination, through, decades, if you will, of trauma where Black farmers lost millions of acres. There were almost 1 million Black farmers at one time, and now we're looking at a little over 44,000. And that came about because of unfair treatment, racism in the U.S. food system, the USDA not really doing the best job in supporting these farmers. And so the work that I do has been really about these Black farmers, their relationship to the land and to their community. And I learned through walking the fields and spending quite a bit of time with them, their worldview, they saw themselves as stewards of the land. Their role really was to support their families and their farms, but also be supportive of the local ecosystem. They were very keen on their role as stewards. And I was fascinated by that, in that, yes, they were out to, make a profit, but they were more concerned with the integrity and the relationship with the soil, the relationship to the forest. Most of these farmers had a forest. They did opportunistic foraging. They were praying in the woods. There were a lot of African-based traditions. And the farmers that I interviewed still practice more of an African-based worldview where everything was included. Everything was sort of the holistic, natural inclusion of the water, as many traditional peoples do still practice today, and so do African American farmers. Their come from was, how does this benefit the larger community of not of people, not just of buildings and other kinds of infrastructure, but how will it affect the beneficial pollinators? How will it affect their other local flora and fauna? And so when I look at this intersection between food, climate, and culture, and I think about Black farmers, for them, their growing strategies had all to do with the climate. It had all to do with the waterways. In one community in South Carolina, the Gullah Gichi community, of which my family are, my father's family are Gullah Gichi, the concern when they do straw baskets or basket weaving is that they're not going to make any baskets from a tree that has been depleted, or if there was a storm. The only time they would use that straw if there was a storm and some of the straw was felled. But otherwise, they would look for other sources of straw in order to make a basket. And these were the same people that during the enslavement period in South Carolina in particular, where rice was the main commodity. Rice was growing in South Carolina from coast to coast. These Africans had to make straw baskets. They called them fanner baskets, and that's how they winnowed the rice. And so on different plantations, you had folks that were able to make these baskets. But these people who knew the trees, they knew the natural flow of the environment. They were more interested, yes, in providing for shelter and other kinds of materials, but they also, as part of that first and second thought, is I want to make sure that I don't deplete it. Same thing about waterways and oyster beds and the fish. If there was, they noticed that the fish supply was being depleted, they wouldn't fish in that particular area. Their role actually was one of regenerating. And I was, fascinated by that. That was the priority. So they were thinking about their relationship to land and the relationship to people, but it was really about the local ecosystem. And food systems with the U.S. modern agriculture food system is one of extraction of land, extraction of labor. And it's the same kind of imbalance that from the very beginning of the paradigm, just take. And then when it's all done, go somewhere else and destroy and do the same thing. So that food system is based on a very exploitive and very extractive model. And that also puts some people at the bottom of that barrel and some people with all of the power. And that's what we have in modern food systems today, and especially in the US, where we have a few. The corporations are protected in general by the large farming entities are protected by U.S. policy and various types of tax breaks. And people who are living in cities and living in poorer communities have no access to food and don't get any kind of a tax break. So the power dynamics really is what we're looking at with regard to social dynamics. Those power dynamics impact the social dynamics. They impact the ability of people to feed themselves and to have a safe community where everybody eats. And so this work, I think of the work that we do, and you see some of the photos with youth. We are looking to make sure that in the next generation, they understand the importance of working locally. The idea that I have is to think globally, but to act locally. And so our work is working in local communities, it's working with local farmers to ensure that the local ecosystem, the local food system is representative of the people that are in the community, and that the people that are in the community are able to have a sense of agency, and that they are able to make decisions, sovereign decisions about the food. In most cases, in particular with Black farmers, they have very little power around land. Their land has been taken, and continues to be a threat as far as losing and becoming dispossessed. So, this work is about making sure that people can stay on their land. Because if farmers are able to stay on their land with their localized knowledge, they're able to feed the community. I've done a lot of interviews with people who were sharecroppers, and I'm not sure if it's probably a longer conversation than right now. But even in those times, in the 1910, the 20s and 30s and 40s, when people didn't have a lot of money, everybody ate. They had a lot of food. People would show up. There was a lot of sharing and caring. Now, we don't factor that into when we look at the food system, but that is how people, Black people in particular, during the earlier part of the 20th century, were able to not starve because other people cared and they shared. And that in and of itself is a type of resiliency. It is the community standing in the gap so that everybody has food. We're quite far away from that now as far as the priority from a community perspective, but we will need to figure out how to, in my thinking, we have to make a way for everybody to eat. It doesn't matter if you have land or if you don't have power, but everybody deserves that honor and dignity to be able to eat. So that's the work that I've been doing with Farms to Grow, particular to make sure that Black farmers have a voice, that people know that they are here, and to continue to preserve that legacy of Black farmers in the U.S.
Thank you so much, Dr. Myers. So now we're going to take the slides down and have all our panelists on the screen. And we'll begin our conversation. So I wanted to pick up on some of the themes that I heard from you speaking about in your introductions. And I wanted to dig down a little bit deeper to make sure our audience has some set of just sort of baseline knowledge of, really what does culture mean for individuals? What does it mean for a community? And I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between identity, history, and cultural context. And I heard this from you, Marie, in your conversation about Manoomin and the Anishinaabe and, what it means to be able to produce that food. And I also know that you have some knowledge of making baskets just like Gail does. And I hear that about Black farmers, what does it mean to be gullah gichi? But also, what does it mean to be an African-American farmer in the United States? Laurel, you touched on that when you talked about corn farmers in Mexico. And Amy, I think you're working with chefs who are thinking about what does it mean to work with farmers and people who produce food? And what does that mean for me as an individual who works in that system? So I wanted to know if you all could give an example of how socio-cultural identity is developed. What are the historical ways that we sort of see that development? And how is it related to food systems? And then finally, does climate change have an impact on how you see yourself in that climate change issue, in that way that food production changes? And I also wonder, and maybe it's too far to push for this first question, is what are ways that we can sort of understand these contexts to shape resiliency or shape the ability of people to be resilient to climate change? Is there some notion of identity, or identity could be good or bad, it doesn't mean anything, but what can we harness from identity to make sure that people can adapt in the way that would be meaningful to them or beneficial to them in the future? So Marie, would you mind starting?
Sure, I'll just break down that real easily in about a minute. So identity, that's an easy one. But basically, food and Anishinaabe go hand in hand. The Manoomin, like I was talking about before, wild rice, it's who we are. It's part of who we are. Really essential to our identity. Anishinaabe started out on the East Coast and traveled the St. Lawrence Seaway because our prophecy said to find the food that grew on the water, wild rice. So we ended up in the Great Lakes area. So it's just part of our story, part of who we are. However, that's, like I was mentioning before, it's gone away. It's very hard to get a harvest of Manoomin now. In Michigan, at least, you can get more as you go further west. Just the impacts of settler colonialism, pollution, the history, and everything on the land is a little bit different, and the policies are a little bit different. But I love the question about resilience and identity, because I feel like we have some answers already to these issues around climate change. My ancestors if they could see what we're going through now, this is their dystopian hell, frankly. The food's not there, but we've gone through this for hundreds of years. So this isn't much new. It's just happening faster. So we have a lot of skills. There's ancestors that had to go on, some, cousins of mine the Trail of Tears, where you're literally going from one ecosystem that to a whole other space and having to learn that whole other ecosystem, those whole other foods. Kyle White from University of Michigan, who's citizen band Potawatomi, talks about this a lot, that his ancestors went through that. So we picked up some tools along the way. We picked up how to adapt somewhat quickly. And I think that we can put that to work in these spaces. So while things like even sugar maple and black ash baskets are part of our identity, and black ash is going away because of emerald ash borer, I do see at Michigan State University in the collections there baskets that are now made out of, this is kind of more of a representation than what I hope is the direction we're going towards, but they're made out of mini blinds, like your white mini blinds, and then just one strip of black ash because the black ash is going away. But still, that means that the skills and the knowledge and all of the things that surround that, who we are in those moments, like if you go to a wild rice camp, or if you go to a basket making time with an elder or with a knowledge holder, you're not just learning the skills of how to harvest manumin or how to make a basket. You're learning your identity. You're learning that relationship with the whole ecosystem and rebuilding that relationship up. It's not just the actual skills from that workshop. It's so much more. So we'll do whatever we need to do at the end of the day. And I feel like not just in Indigenous communities, but a lot of communities, we have these skills, and we can kind of work together to navigate it. But it is happening a lot quicker. So we need to get on it, basically. Miigwech.
Gail, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Marie, when you mentioned rice, I think of in West Africa, the reason that the Senegambians, which Senegal and Gambia, country on the west part of Africa, were brought into the U.S. is because they knew rice, and so they developed this whole state of South Carolina, thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, by just taking a forest, basically chopping down the trees, making canoes, making these intricate waterways. They were engineers, they were hydrologists, and they were that because over time, the soils in West Africa, because of the tropical rainy season, there were very short periods when they could actually grow in a soil that was not flooded. So you have to learn the environment. So they waited until there was some relief, and then they would take a seed in the soil and transplant it from a wet pond and transplant it into a dry area. So those are thousands and thousands of years of trial and error. And so those people, the African people, inherited this knowledge of working with everything in the local environment, which is how we all in most traditional communities, they are adapting to the local environment. What's there? Is it a lot of rainfall this year? No rainfall? Is it a drought? Well, how can we grow in a drought? Is that perennial or is that annual? So people make decisions again around food by what's available and what they learn and what they're able to survive. If you're in a community and you tried this and folks go back a couple hundred years and the whole community is wiped out, it's like, well, I guess that didn't work. But if you're in a community and you've tested this and it's great, people are eating, they're thriving. And so those principles of the people that are practicing those strategies in West Africa were actually brought into the U.S. and the Africans became African Americans, ended up having that same sense of understanding of the environment. So Black folks in America are plant-based people, just like African people. They are plant-based people. They are land-based people. And so there is an intricate and clear connection between the land and their role in taking care of the land and feeding the community and being able to thrive. And so what that says around identity, eventually that becomes connected to food. You know, what grows in this environment? If you've ever been to New Orleans, you know about the gumbo, right? It's the base of okra and tomatoes. Well, the okra, which we call okra, actually is called gumbo in West Africa. Those same foods are grown. And when we look at, for those of us that look at health outcomes of people who are eating traditional food, and we look at the people who are 90 and 100, they're still able to, they have the same, their teeth, their hair, is because they're eating that traditional food. And so even as there's a trial and error around the environment, people learn what foods heal what conditions. We need this bitters for this. We need Okra is very good for the digestive tract. And so a lot of the food traditions, I've interviewed over 100 people, and they're all growing tomatoes, okra, um, squash, and all of these are foods that have and watermelon, have their roots in the African continent. So people are connected to those traditions. And so they're adapting. People adapt to their environment, and based on those particular adaptations will determine, what people eat. And so their identity really is tied to the relationship to the food, the relationship to the environment. And so people are still growing okra today as they were 3,000 years ago in Gambia and in Senegal. And so that is how that's one way that people identify through the food, through the culture, and through those various traditions that, again, have everything to do, through the work that I've seen, with people's relationship to land. So identity, very much tied to how people relate to land and the community and the food. So foodways are part of identity. One of the other things that I know that is so present within the African tradition is the collective, the group. So people are always cooking more than enough food. I've been in places, and why so much food? Because somebody might stop by. That's a part of your identity. Even if it's just one or two people, even and my mom and I, we're together, and we end up cooking more than we need because either leftovers or someone may stop by. But that's a tradition, and that's an identity, and it's not so much now, but I remember it when I was a girl growing up. That if somebody came by and you were eating, you were to offer them a plate. It is now almost unheard of. You go to somebody's house for dinner, it's like, we'll be out in just a moment. But those traditions are practices that are tied to the belief that everybody should eat. So yes, that's a part of identity, and it goes even, in my mind, even deeper than identity. I'll stop there.
Well, that's a wonderful reminder that, identity doesn't have to just be an item. It can be a way of engaging with other people. It's just a very nice thought to keep in mind always. But something I heard you say, Gail, was about trial and error and flexibility and change over time, that when the climate was different, whether there was a drought or a heavy rainstorm, that people had to experiment with seeds. And that's one way to look at change, but also in Laurel, some of the examples you gave in your opening was about, global forces causing change and how people had to adapt in that way in order to survive. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how corn fits into that picture of change and identity.
Sure. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not going to share such a positive view on all of this for a few minutes. I'll come back around to maybe some hopeful things. But, a lot of what comes up in my work in southern Mexico is really understanding how history shapes current vulnerabilities. So, in the case of southern Mexico, food systems have shifted from polycrop systems that were focused on, the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash, and multiple other greens and things in the field, and crop rotations, to, in the 20th century, the shift to a productivist model of agriculture brought in the Green Revolution and a lot of state-led policies that have actively shaped and reshaped farmer cultures and practices. So something that I really draw out in my work is thinking about how current vulnerabilities are directly linked to agricultural policies over the last 60 years and how that has shifted farmer culture and farmers' ways of knowing and responding to these. So, with the shift to more industrial approaches to agriculture and intensive crop production, we've seen a big loss in terms of farmer autonomy and control over seeds and resources, and this shifting of, kind of moving the expertise from the farm level to kind of the extension agent level. And for many years, that system, at least in Mexico, was very much propped up by the government. And what I found when I was doing field work in Mexico a few years ago was that, as climate change becomes more of a reality and farmers are experiencing higher incidence of crop loss and yield declines, it's not just linked to the current of those decades of degrading the land and adopting systems that are extremely chemically intensive and reliant on chemicals to produce a yield. So I think in geography, there's this concept of double exposure, that at the same time that farmers are being threatened by climate change and multiple other environmental stressors, there's also the shift to a neoliberal economic context that has reduced a lot of those public supports to farmers that really has bolstered that system for the last 60 years. So, I think in the case of Mexico, there's really, it's a pretty well-known story at this point that the free trade policies like NAFTA, resulted in a huge dumping of cheap corn from the U.S. into Mexico, and how that's had dramatic impacts on how on economics and diets and all sorts of things. But I think a part of the story that's much less known is how those shifts to the free market have been accompanied with a whole rollback of public supports, right? So there's actually been this huge shift to a privatized and corporatized system of seeds, inputs, and extension services. And now they're primarily dominated by large multinational corporations like Monsanto, now Bayer, DuPont, and others. And when you talk to farmers on the ground, which is what I love to do, is be on the ground and see what the reality is farmers are really, and going back to what Marie said, caught between a rock and a hard place. They're being confronted with these changes that are overwhelming and that are challenging even some of the elders' traditional knowledge about how to track weather and when to plant and all of these things. But at the same time, they're lacking. They don't have the kind of public supports that used to help them weather those difficult times. And there's a lot of exodus from agriculture right now. I mean, we're seeing a huge movement out of agriculture among younger generations. And the generations that are trying to stay or return migrants from the U.S. after a failed migration experience, a lot of them are trying to do that work of recovering their seeds, recovering some of that traditional knowledge, and recovering some of their autonomy that has been lost over time, that has really heightened their experiences of vulnerability today.
Thanks so much, Laurel. I want to push Amy to connect to Laurel in some ways, because your concept of proximate eating or proximate diet that you mentioned before is that we make decisions about what's around us. And, in some ways what Laurel's talking about is the thing that could be distant from somebody who eats from a supermarket in Vermont. Vermont's also an interesting place where there's a lot of local eating, but that can't be true for everyone across the board who maybe buys commodities in a marketplace. So how do you understand identity in place, and how, if you're eating from commodity foods from a supermarket or in an urban space, for example, how do you connect to those farmers in Mexico who are struggling with climate issues and lack of access? How do you understand, how to make a choice that is connected in some way to climate or to fair labor?
Okay, that's great. That's big, but I love some big questions. Yeah, I think that, again, I want to bring it back to the fact that in some ways, I think we're increasingly globally sharing the same set of threats and opportunities, that the experience of somebody living in Oaxaca and somebody living in Vermont may not be as radically different as it might have been, 50 years ago, though very similar to how these might have been similar 100 years ago, in the sense that we have systems and structures now that are enabling or forcing people to not necessarily only be embedded in their place, right? That we can't really live the way we want to live and only be embedded in place. And part of that is an advantage because subsistence is quite a difficult way to live. And oftentimes we had huge problems of people being subject to mass famine and things like that. And we have different ways of moving food than we used to. But along the way, what we're doing is we're putting increasingly individuals in very difficult situations where they have to maybe make choices that they don't want to make about loss of certain types of practices that are embedded and rooted in place. And so I think that's some of what, Laurel is talking about, is that, maybe a farmer in southern Mexico really would like to keep using their original indigenous practices around corn, but it's increasingly impossible to do so. And when you have disconnected consumers who don't even necessarily understand why those practices are advantageous, either from a stewardship of the land point of view or from a culinary or sensory point of view, you're in a very difficult situation. And so part of, I think, the struggle that we all have now is not only are we seeing kind of the loss of biodiversity from the point of view of ecological biodiversity, but also cultural biodiversity and culinary biodiversity, is we're also now saying, okay, wait a second, and now we're going to have all this environmental change because of climate issues. Okay, let's just put that on top of the situation, right? So it's very difficult, and then there's a whole question of who should be making what changes and why. And I think this is one of the things that I think a lot about, because I worry that we will say we have a tendency, particularly institutional structures and cultures of expertise, can tend to create sweeping ideas about how change should happen. And it ultimately is on the backs of individual people. And usually it's on the back of individual people who don't have a lot of power in the system. So I think that that's somewhat a little bit what Laurel and Gail and Marie have been talking about. And so I think that if we want to think about climate resilience and we want to think about farm systems and food systems, how do we create agency whereby those who are doing the practices on an individual daily basis aren't, in a sense, bearing the brunt for some of the, the problematic practices that have led us to where we are. So when it comes to place, I think super complicated, because I think, right, we increasingly don't use our physical environments to nourish ourselves. And so we have to kind of accept that, I think, at some level, that we have large scalar systems that are actually nourishing us, whether or not we like it or not. It's what's feeding a lot of the world's population. In the state of Vermont, I just wanted to point out, people love to say how Vermont is, so great. And, I live here, I like it. But at maximum, we're talking about 15 to 16% total local or regional food purchases, okay? Maximum. So we are all struggling here in the state to keep our farmers farming. They're particularly, one of the things about a market system is you follow the greatest new trend, right? So the traditional ecological model that Marie and Gail brought up, for contemporary farming, that's really gone for many, many people, and it's market-based approaches that are what people are doing. So, for example, in the state of Vermont, we're really into beer and CBD and THC infused products right now. That's like the uptrend line in farming right now in our state. So, not really sure how that's going to do for our individual nourishment and health, but it will keep us calm as things transpire. I don't know if I go off on a tangent, but I just think that's really interesting. I do want to also say that, I think I would, of course, and this is just a lot of my own interest, I would love to see us really think about that interconnectedness and interdependence of the way that we produce our food from the land, and then the way that we actually consume our food, and the practices that we need in order to do that in a meaningful way. So I was just teaching a class. I teach a class on that combines food science, food systems, culinary, meal preparation, and I had a great scene yesterday where I had these lovely juniors and seniors in college, and one of them holds up this thing and says to me, "What's this?" And I said, "That's kale." And then I had another student who held up this, and these are all majors in nutrition or environmental sciences. And I had another student hold up something and say, "What's this?" And I said, "That's a sprig of rosemary." And they're like, "Huh, okay." So we have a lot of knowledge loss, but we also have possibility for knowledge gain, is what I would say.
Thank you so much, Amy. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to talk about the impacts of climate change. They're often coupled with multiple events of climate change, multiple disasters, but also other social stressors. And those social stressors, when mixed with a climate event, can exacerbate inequalities between people, especially among underserved and marginalized populations. We saw that a lot in COVID-19, and there were a lot of connections between health outcomes from COVID-19 and issues of food insecurity. So I wanted to know, in your experiences, what have you learned about these sort of compound or concurrent events and our food systems? And I know, Laurel, you've been working on this a little bit, so I'll turn to you first.
Hey, sure. Yeah, so part of what we've been doing, our research team here in Arizona has been trying to understand the impacts of COVID-19 on our food systems in general, and then like what are the similarities and differences that we can track between the global food system and more local or regional food systems. And I think maybe some of the upsides of like the current pandemic is that we've really, in my lifetime at least, I cannot recall a time when there's been so much public attention on food. And I think, a lot of that really started when the pandemic hit, that, and people were the panic buying and the empty shelves and concerns about supply chains. And then we started seeing the outbreaks in the meat processing plants, and also the higher mortality rates of people with diet-related diseases, and how COVID has had higher impacts with those populations. And I think all of that is really serving as like an alarm to a lot of people that like the current system is not working. And I think there's this is a really powerful moment to like seize on that attention to start making some changes and shifting. And one of the things that has really been borne out in our work, and I think from other studies I've seen recently, is about local food systems during this time, is that the importance of having pre-established connections and relationships when a crisis hits. Like I've seen so many examples of that where people had pre-established connections and organizing structures. They were able to respond in real time to the crisis and move food from, one of the big challenges has been shifting, with the shutdown of schools and all these institutional purchases and restaurant purchases, like shifting the local supply chains of food to institutions and then shifting them to like food to direct to consumers. And here in the Tucson region, we saw real powerful evidence of like those pre-existing relationships allow people to very quickly like re-engineer those systems and make sure that farmers still got paid and food still got to people in need. And I think that another thing that we've seen, and like I really want to acknowledge Amy's point about the global food system is what's like feeding people, is feeding the majority of calories to the majority of us. And this is a tension that's constantly in my head, constantly in my heart of like, well, how do we advocate for local food systems, knowing what a kind of really small part of the puzzle it is. And I keep coming back to, a lot of the lessons that we've seen during COVID is like, we need those relationships. We need to, there's now really a lot of evidence about the importance of like human connection to nature and to each other. And, that local food systems aren't just about food, but they're also about connection and history and taste of place and, our psychological health and well-being and all of these things. And so even though small, I want to say like also mighty, and like there's great potential there. I think a lot of lessons to be shared out. And even as like, local food systems also, aren't just innately better, right? We also have to continue doing the hard work of like reckoning with really unjust past and practices, and also acknowledging like who's at the table and who's not. And that's a lot of the work that I and my colleagues will continue to do. I hope that answered some of the questions. So I'm not sure if I went on it.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you work very directly with farmers also. Did you see any instances of farmers dealing with impacts from climate change while they were also dealing with COVID-19, either on the production side or on the consumer side, more food inaccessibility or food inequality or food insecurity, any of those words, were they exacerbated by the compound of the two events?
Is that a question for me?
That was a question for you, yes.
Okay. Yes, actually, we did see impacts of COVID on the farmers' production and consumption. We actually saw a lot of folks in the Oakland, Northern California area eating much more local from farmers. There, apparently a lack of food in the grocery stores, or people just decided they wanted to support local farmers. So we actually had a positive impact in many ways with including more consumers within our food program. But I will say that I think with regard to resiliency, there's a way to look at that as the collective. And, I'm thinking of this sort of connective tissue that we can use as an idea is that, and I hear this, I go to this often to my mom. If there's something that I just, I'm just like puzzled by, she may not know the answer, but in her wisdom as an elder. And so I see, and I've seen this as well, is these relationships of going back to our elders and getting that wisdom. It's like one of the most underutilized assets that we have in our community. Possibly they've never dealt with the notion of, mass, fast moving hurricanes, but people know how to adapt to situations. And that's why to me, that's really the key role right now in our society of figuring out how to integrate this elder wisdom into these ways in which we're dealing with right now. And I've seen a lot of that, and I think that that's one of the things that's really missing. As I mentioned around earlier from interviews that I've had with people who are sharecroppers. Sharecroppers historically had not a lot of money. They were just from December to December waiting for the check or waiting for someone, the master or whoever this person was that had all the land and had all the money. But even so, everybody was eating. And so I think if we get out of our individual ideas around how to solve this and get into the collective ideas on how to solve this, I think we all have a shot at eating. We all have a shot at surviving this, but we can't do it alone. And I know that, don't know how to, we got to figure out how to do a circle of elders who can maybe get us out of this. But that's where I'm putting my money. I'm putting my money on my great aunts, my grandmas, my moms, all the moms and dads that, the folks that are in their 90s, in the hundreds, in their wisdom, who also have an undying trust and belief in a higher power. And so that's one of the things that get people through, no matter, how we value that or believe in that. But there is a reliance on something bigger than who they are. And with regard to that, I think that's, something that is resilient. And I think, again, we are better and more resilient together figuring this stuff out. And to me, that's the connective tissue.
Thanks, Gail. And I want to move into our last portion of the moderated questions and turn to Marie and Amy, thinking towards the future and asking if we wanted to really push these themes into climate science in a more standardized way, in a way that was more accessible and could really bring food, climate, and culture together. What are some of the research directions that we should think about? What are the things that are missing that have maybe kept this research, these kinds of conversations, these frameworks in mainstream climate research spaces? Marie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my neighbor is mowing, so if you just let me know if it gets difficult to hear the challenges of working from home. I would say I would love to, kind of talk about who's at the table, but I'd also love how do we build that table? What is going on at that table? Who gets to make the decisions about what the table even is? And so those I've seen really great, and I've been able to work with the graduate fellows at the USGS Northeast Climate Science Center and have them out for one of the annual retreats at Menominee Nation. We put them to work processing wild rice. So these are graduate students that are not social scientists. They're all the other ists of climate change. And so to get that kind of feel, literally a feel for knowledge, and as you work, you learn. Just like I was talking about before, and what we've been talking about, not just about, the steps of how to process wild rice, but you start to build that connection to place. And I think that's a key, is as we're building a connection to place and reestablishing a relationship to each other, like Gail was talking about, and that collective. I love that. Yeah, listening to aunties, listening to Nokomis's, for sure, their wisdom. But as you build that connection, then you see those opportunities and you see those challenges. You notice the challenges quicker, because I think all of us, especially in the pandemic, are a little overloaded and just kind of want to get our groceries and go on with our day as best we can. But if you have a connection with place, if you start to reestablish that connection, like I was saying, you can notice the changes that are happening, and then you can respond to those changes. But I do think that personally, I think that we need to have a lot more spaces where we listen to each other and we have conversations about how do we build the table and who's at the table and who gets to make those decisions, and how do we braid Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge? How do we look at this more holistically? And frankly, sometimes it's not the academics in the room that need to make the decisions. It's the people that are impacted the most. And so I will gladly take myself off the table even, and invite others, or have them create spaces. So I'm excited about creating those, helping to create those spaces. So yeah, watch.
Thanks so much, Marie. Amy, do you want to take a stab at future research directions?
Sure. So I think that, and sort of to follow up on something that Gail said about elders and thinking about, where does knowledge or wisdom reside? And this tension, I think, oftentimes we have between a concept of wisdom versus a concept of expertise. And in a sense, how do we imagine futures that we actually can't quite grasp? I mean, that's a lot of what everyone's doing right now, is trying to imagine this future. And there's a lot of work being done with prediction and modeling and all of these things to say, here's some possible ways this is going to spin out. And then we also have traditions and the people with traditional knowledge, and then we have the power structures and the expertise structures. And for me, sort of sitting in the middle of all of this, because I'm trained as an anthropologist, but I have a lot of practice background in cooking and also farming, I decided, and I got involved with colleagues because I realized that I had to figure out a way to combine these predictions of the future that are based on sort of quantitative ideas about imagining the future with sort of my belief in the everyday wisdom of people on the ground. So I'm working with some an ecologist, and complex systems expert with myself and a food systems postdoc who worked with me as a PhD on a serious game. And serious games are sort of this very interesting new research methodology where you actually create scenarios and people play games and they get inside of worlds where they have to make a series of decisions, and that it can help us understand what understandings they come to with the situation and the way they might make choices along the way as they imagine a scenario that is not just a reproduction of the way they live something out every day. So our serious game is going to try to deal with the paradox that we have small, local and regional farmers growing whole food, fruits and vegetables who live in poverty, and then we have people living in poverty who can't get access to affordable whole fruits and vegetables. And we have a system that basically creates a situation where neither group actually can really benefit from what is hopefully or idealistically what we all want, is farmers growing whole fruits and vegetables that nourishes their communities, all members of their community, and it doesn't matter their socioeconomic status. So it's a really, really interesting and exciting project, and it's one of the ways that I'm trying to think about or imagine how we as social scientists and scientists can work together to imagine future so that we can actually create a future that we want for 7 generations from now.
I hope we can imagine that too and bring it to fruition. Thanks, Amy. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Bree Farber from the Department of Energy and Emily Brooks from the Department of Interior to handle our Q&A from the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Ariella, and to our wonderful panelists. It's been so great to hear you all talk about this topic together. So kind of combining a question that we got from the audience for all of you and kind of taking Amy's last point and points that everyone's made kind of throughout the conversation about climate resilience and adaptation and looking to the future, and then building a little bit on this question from Mark. Let's see, let me make sure I have it. There it is. Okay. So from Mark, as climate change rapidly takes place, can cultural adaptive learning take place at a comparable rate? So kind of asking about what is our hope, what hope do people see? And to build on that a little bit, specifically in what ways does culture facilitate adaptation and resilience? Then if people want to speak to this as well, what might be the ramifications for individuals and communities when cultural practices or significant places are made vulnerable? So blending in kind of the risk, and the need for adaptation and resilience when we're looking at climate change futures. And I'll leave it open to anyone who wants to start first. I don't know if Laurel or Gail, if you want to jump in, or Marie.
I would start by saying, sort of back to sort of the things that I've been mentioning is the people have to be a part of this, especially traditional people who have been used to adapting to a changing environment, changing political landscape, changing, food access. And so that has to be incorporated. The people who have been resilient over time. And they have to be included in the discussion. their stories, which is the important piece of narratives, of especially narratives that have a very small footprint, because we learn so much from listening to stories of people from various speaking communities, various geographic communities, and how they've adapted, and we can borrow from those stories. And I think that there is room for sort of the cultural merging, as well as understanding more of the issues around climate change. But part of it is we have to kind of get out of our own way. We've got to really change some of the paradigms, some of the ways in which we think of who our community is. Our community oftentimes are people who don't look, who are your people oftentimes is a question that I ask people, who are your people? Well, when it comes to climate, we are all our people, because we'll be perishing in this nice little boat together if we don't get it together. But that being said, it is figuring out a way to make sure that we can include the voices, and that we can prioritize not just the folks that have the expertise. I love that the way you described that, Amy. But in many ways, prioritize people that have almost the years and the experience of being on the planet.
Thank you so much, Gail. Yes, Laurel, please.
Yeah, sure. I'll dive in on that question. That question about like whether culture can adapt as quick as climate change is happening. I mean, that's the open question, right? That's the huge question that confronts us with ever more urgency. And something that I guess I can offer from my work in Chiapas is like, when I originally started that research, I hypothesized that it was going to be really like that farmer vulnerability was going to be much higher among highland farmers, because they're in highland landscapes and for a lot of different reasons. But what I found out was that actually a lot of the mountain agricultural peoples still have their seeds, and they have been actively adapting their seeds to changing conditions in their mountain systems for a long time. And they also tend to be farms that are much smaller and that have some sort of off-farm income. And it's actually been the kind of small scale commercial farmers in lowland regions that don't have access to safe seeds and that have lost a lot of that traditional knowledge that is guided, how people track environmental changes and planting schedules and whatnot. And those are really the farmers that are really in crisis right now. And the systems are not in place to help them adapt. And there is evidence of, ongoing dispossession of those farmers and a continued concentration of land and resources among, increasingly elite populations as kind of smaller landholders either rent or sell their land in order to just get by. So I think, the work that most excites me right now is, as has been expressed by, I think, all of the panelists, is like really moving from this individualist kind of business mentality about farming and food systems to really collective thinking and visioning. And I can think of examples both here in the States and in Mexico where there is collective visioning and organizing happening. There is this, attempt to recover seeds, recover traditions, and then also to Marie's approach, also braid that with like new understandings and new technologies and ways of knowing. So like the farmer collectives in Mexico, they're also they're not just looking to the elders, but they're also getting rain gauges and learning how to track climate, and they're learning how to use massive worm composting and crop rotations and how to integrate kind of food crops with commercial crops. And those are the systems that I think we need to really be investing in and supporting with public supports and while we have a market society, also in how we purchase.
And I just wanted to add about the kind of, can we like develop as rapidly as, or the culture can develop rapidly along with climate change. I like the concept, the seventh generation teaching that I've been taught as well, not only 7 generations ahead, but it's the generations behind your current generation and the 3 generations ahead of you. So it's kind of what Laurel was just talking about, that, you know, we have that knowledge, we're learning right now, and then looking to the future as well for those future generations. And I know we're coming up against time, and I love this one question. So about the giving us $10 million to spend, invest, or donate. I frankly, kind of tying it into this question, would try to mandate in every public school some sort of food systems course, just like they have in Canada for Indigenous studies. I'd like the Indigenous studies too, but having that connection, again, like we were talking about, with your place and your foods, it changes the conversation. You're not kind of just going through the landscape, you're actually part of the landscape, you're part of the land. So that would be something that I would do with my $10 million. That would go away in a drop with indirects at a university, but anyways.
Unfortunately, we have to move on, but I'm so happy we at least got to 2 of those questions. And I just want to thank all of our panelists, who I consider both experts and knowledge holders. And so, you know, this has been such a wonderful, rich conversation, and I hope it's been helpful for the audience to really hear about these kinds of perspectives. We've asked Amber Campbell from the USDA to give some concluding remarks to bring all the wonderful things you said together, for some parting words for the audience. So I'm going to hand it over to Amber, and just thank you all for your participation. Amber?
Okay, yes, I'm here. I'm trying to get, there we go. I got my video to come on. Thank you first of all, so much to all of the speakers, Gail, Laurel, Amy, and Marie. This has been great. I'm just going to kind of give some summary thoughts of what really came out to me in all of your discussions. I think some of the big things that really spoke to me were the notion of how food connects to these issues that we think of as cultural issues of identity and practice and place, and how the ability to produce food or to be engaged with the land in the cultivation or harvesting of food really connects to that notion of place and embeddedness within it, as well as the sort of historical trajectory of how did we get here and how that plays into issues of equity, justice, and kind of those compounding disasters at the same time. So the dispossession of African American farmers, or the colonial dispossession of Native American rice gatherers, or just the inability of people living in modern urban contexts to have a connection with where their food comes from. And so, like, dealing with that lack of knowledge, and how do we think about food and create systems that allow us to kind of embrace some notion that everyone should have access to those things. And how do we kind of reckon with that unjust past in order to create a more just future? And kind of wrapping up with that idea of this need for collective thinking and involving diverse ways of knowing and knowledges in order to kind of bridge those gaps and face the challenges that we have in our future in terms of dealing with food and climate change. And Austin promised me there would be a slide that told me I'm supposed to let you know about the upcoming webinar in 2 weeks. And I was promised there would be a slide that told me when that was. There we go. Excellent. Oh, I also want to, again, thank the planning committee, Ariella Zeikerman, Brianna Farber, myself, Austin Sheets, and Emily Brooks for putting this all together. And a special thanks to Tia Biggs from the USGCRP, Chelsea Hombes Friedman from NOAA, Jia Li from the World Bank, formerly from EPA, and the NOAA Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program, also known as RISA, for their contributions to today's program. And we have 2 upcoming webinars, as Ariella mentioned at the beginning. So the next one is on September 28th from 2:30 or from 12:30 to 2 Eastern, and then following one on putting culture into practice on October 12th from 1 to 2:30 Eastern. So thank you so much for joining us, and I believe you should have the registration information. If not, you can definitely contact us, and I think his contact information was on all of the flyers that we sent out earlier.